Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this side event, The Case on Iraq, where we will talk about the topic, the Human Rights Council and the mass human rights violations. Before we start our event, please be reminded that it's not allowed to take any pictures, so that's a new regulation by the Secretariat. However, of course, this is with the exception of those by the organizers, pictures taken by the organizers. So I kindly ask all of you to respect that. Well, as you know, the case of Iraq is an example is a disaster on many levels. First of all, as we all know, it was a war of aggression, illegal, without a mandate of the Security Council, that destroyed an entire country on all its levels. A country that was a pillar and the most advanced in the Middle East was totally destroyed. However, it wasn't only about the destruction of the country, but also the measures that followed the war on Iraq that were illegal, as well as a lack of investigation or bringing those responsible to justice. As we all agree, if there is a case of tremendous human rights violations that is not brought to justice, when there is no investigation, no accountability, the international community will lose credibility. So by now we have with us several experts, witnesses who can talk about what they've seen on the ground, who will also talk about the investigation or the lack of investigation when it comes to the case of Iraq, and also talk about possibilities of accountability and how bringing those responsible to justice. As a first speaker, I would like to introduce Mr. John Pache. He is a senior human rights humanitarian official. He was in Liberia, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, and Nepal. He was head of the United Nations Special Procedures and many other UN agencies. He has seen the development of all UN mechanisms from the beginning on until today. And he will talk about the non-investigation of the human rights situation in Iraq today. Thank you very much for being here with us, and you have the floor.
Red button, and I'm on that. Perfect, thank you. You know, I spent 33 years of my life in these rooms and in various field assignments. So my career has been varying between wearing a suit and a tie and sitting usually on the left-hand side of the chairperson or running around various countries trying to follow up on decisions of the then Commission on Human Rights. I was head of the Human Rights Office in Baghdad, in UNAMI, from 2004 to 2006, February. And after that, when I completed my assignment, I have two nationalities. I'm Maltese. I'm an old Maltese, but I'm also a young Australian, because I became Australian early in the century. And in Australia, I was charged with training program for Iraqi officials, which lasted about 4 years, in the course of which we trained over 200 Iraqi officials from various ministries, mainly the former Ministry of Human Rights, which today does not exist anymore. What I'm here to say is based on my knowledge of human rights investigation, specifically the so-called country rapporteurs. Iraq was the subject of such a special procedure. Max van der Stoel of the Netherlands was the first rapporteur after the first war in the Gulf, and then he was succeeded when he gave up by Mavromatis, who was also chairman of the Human Rights Committee at that time from Cyprus. But when the invasion took place in 2003, the mandate of that rapporteurship was ended. Instead came then what eventually became, as we know it today, UNAMI. my colleague to my left, Tahar, was head of that office after a few years later. There was great hope at that time in regard to monitoring the situation of human rights in Iraq. And so we set up a system. I was brought in after the office was bombed in 2003, so I had to start the whole setup. So we set up in Amman and then set up in Baghdad, in Erbil, in Basra, and to some extent in Nasiriyah, until the situation of security became very difficult and we were kind of limited. But still, our job there was to construct a base of information based on interviews with victims, with families of victims. And so therefore the office in Amman was very important because there was a huge influx of Iraqis into Jordan. And we were interviewing people hours every day, sometimes on weekends, depending on the arrivals. And eventually we spread our network. There were a number of non-governmental Iraqi organizations which were forming. Some were associations of victims of human rights from the previous regime, and so on. But, and we did some headway, but the main obstacle there was that you couldn't really get this information out to the various instances, to the various organs that could do something about it, because it was said that Iraq was in a transition. It was in fact under occupation. There was a transitional authority, and then UNAMI came in. And UNAMI carried on the good work of what we called monitoring and reconstruction. And over the first few years, my 2 years in the country and 4 years after that, we could see an emergence as the national government took place, the political structures were formed, and the first constitution was legislated. The Ministry of Human Rights had been created, and we were tasked with supporting it. Worked really quite well for a time. And then towards, as I was leaving, I could see that the focus on the actual reality of human rights in the country was waning. It was not really any longer the protection of the individual and the families that at the beginning was the focus of the human rights concerns. So we had an issue with the proposal to set up an independent commission on human rights, and I speak now with the luxury of retirement, so I can be a little bit more clear in what I say. I think national human rights commissions are very important, but they can never be a substitute for direct reporting. National human rights commissions navigate between NGOs and the government, but they are neither one nor the other at any given time, and they can never be really truly independent. In my other country, Australia, for example, the National Human Rights Commission has been the subject of great pressures, vilification, as well as praise and strengthening, depending on the government in question. So anyway, at the domestic level in Iraq, the protection of the human rights of the individual had less and less recourse to remedy, because there was nobody really that they could address themselves to. And UNAMI, therefore, was tasked with the responsibility of taking this reality and trying to bring it out. And we used to produce every month or so a report for the Security Council in which we timidly included a few chapters, a few paragraphs on the situation of human rights, which eventually led to the Human Rights Commission and then the Council to consider Iraq in a technical assistance context. Now, for you, just to refresh your memories, in the early days of special procedures, that is investigation, some countries were improving their situation. And so in order not to give them the stigma of being under investigation, they were considered to be the subjects of assistance, of technical assistance. So was the case of Guatemala, so was the case of a number of other countries in the region, especially in the Americas. And Iraq came, and that presumed that if you are being technically assisted, you are no longer investigated. However, the situation, the reality never really transited. It's not like a switch turning on and off. There was always a little bit of abuse left, even as you were training. Otherwise, you don't need to train. And therefore, the situation in Iraq became much more out of proportion in regard to assistance, and correspondingly much less in regard to investigation. Moreover, then emerged ISIS, and that created a huge deflection, a huge smokescreen, if you like. So if you look at the record of the Council, you will see a special session. You see resolutions of the Council dedicated to the nasty things ISIS was doing, and they did. They were doing horrible things. And if you look at the, if you like, official literature on the website of the Human Rights High Commissioner, you will see several reports dealing with the situation of human rights in Iraq. But hardly any, in fact, none of them, you tell me when I go overboard. Hardly any of them, in fact, none actually cover the situation of the families, the younger people, or the older, the professionals, the judiciary, the reality, the daily reality in Iraq. And so, I just printed out the page on the UNAMI human rights reports. I'm sure you'll say more about this. This is a list of reports, you know, until last year, this 2017, and starting in 2005. But if you look at some of them, or all of them, if you wish, you'll hardly ever see anything really speaking about, for example, cases of disappearances, people, or summary executions, people being assassinated shortly, like in some cases that you might have read, because some of it does reach the media, but very little, unfortunately. And again, with the page on Iraq for the reports, that's UNAMI, right? And then this is OHCHR. And what do I see? Special procedures. The Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. Very important subject. But what about the right to life? What about the right to freedom from torture? What about the fact that the security services in Iraq today are actually controlling anything that comes out of the country? And therefore, the individual in Iraq simply does not enjoy the protection that international human rights law dedicates. Before the rapporteur on minority issues, the rapporteur on internally displaced persons. The IDP issue in Iraq is so-called multiple. It's called a complex issue, not simple, because there is primary displacement, there is secondary displacement. You remember from the south, from the returnees after the invasion, then between the Kurds and the migrants from the Arabs from the Kirkuk and the area around that area. So we have at least 3 layers of displacement in Iraq, which is fine. But again, what about, dare I say, real human rights that affect your life, your freedom? None. And I don't want to bore you, but if you look at that page, you will see that the special procedures, the Council has been dancing around the reality of human rights violations in Iraq and not actually tackling it. So that's the point on the need for investigation. A word about the Council. You know, when the Council was formed in 2006, it was meant to replace the Commission, which had become politicized. I like to cook, and I realize when I cook and I use the same ingredients, the food tastes the same. Okay? The Commission on Human Rights and the Council has very little change in the ingredients. They are the same, except that the Council somebody put too much, I think, salt in it, because it has closed its doors to civil society. We are sitting here in a side event. This is a mainstream event, not a side event. This discussion should be taking place in the Council, not in a room on the side. And therefore, it is imperative that the culture that has developed in the Council, and that is the reason why you only have those special rapporteurs dealing with this issue, the culture that has developed needs to be redressed. And for that, and I will wind up with my last point, and I hope I can answer some questions later, I believe that civil society needs to play a much stronger role. At the moment, civil society, if you look at the procedure for inscribing your name, for getting your place, it's hell. I have never seen, I mean, I was Secretary of the Commission on Human Rights for 16 years, and I have dealt with NGOs. My last year as Secretary was 1994. I organized the World Conference in Vienna. I had, what was it, 13,000 participants or whatever, regional meetings everywhere. But NGOs were at the heart of the work. You cannot have a discussion, a serious discussion on human rights, unless you have not just the input, not just like a footnote like it is today, UPR, contribution, 10 pages, footnote, and then a list of reports by NGOs that you're lucky to find if you look carefully for it. So we have a lopsided council, a council that is totally isolated itself, really, from the reality on the ground, which is civil society. So civil society, in my opinion, needs to find better ways of strengthening their interaction around the issues. I'm not criticizing, but I'm clinically stating what I have observed over the 40-plus years that I have been involved on these issues. And I can say the same thing about a number of other countries as well. I'm not singling out Iraq, but I do feel a special place in my heart, because the 2 years I spent in Baghdad and the other regions of Iraq brought to me home the nobility of spirit and culture of Iraq and its people, the strength of its character, and therefore, and the debt that the world owes the people of Iraq in terms of its history and in terms of its formation. So we are doing ourselves a disfavor if we continue to ignore the human rights reality in Iraq, and especially the indifference or the, I don't know what it is, I can criticize the council because I'm old now, certainly needs to be chipped at. And I think the ball is nowhere else except in the hands of civil society. I will stop now, because as I said to Daniela, she gave me 10 minutes, and I said 10 hours might be easier. But I do hope that it'll be possible to continue this discussion further. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I have to object. I would like to listen to you 10 hours. Unfortunately, here we are time-bound. So we will continue with our next speaker, who has been following our first speaker in Iraq. So his name is Tahar Boumedra. He is a former UN Human Rights Chief of the UN of UNAMI, and then he was advisor to the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Iraq. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Daniela.
And you have the floor.
You have heard John speaking how UNAMI was set up, and I'm going to brief you on how we work towards finishing the mandate of UNAMI and dismantle it. Basically, UNAMI, as John have left it, was radically changed and transformed by a resolution adopted in 2007, which redefined the mission and the purposes of having a UNAMI in Iraq. What was really obstructing the monitoring of human rights in Iraq was the fact that there was a clause saying that nothing could be done under the UNAMI mandate without the express authorization of the government of Iraq, meaning that UNAMI and all UN agencies cannot, all UN agencies, UNAMI cannot do anything without requests from the Prime Minister's office. And that became a serious obstruction to the monitoring of human rights in Iraq. So I was really unlucky to arrive just at this time when a new resolution of the Security Council was adopted. And worse than that, I also arrived exactly the day when the SOFA agreement came into force. And the SOFA agreement is the arrangement between the United States and the government of Iraq for the withdrawal of the American forces after the gradual closing down of the other allied forces and their leaving Iraq. So basically, let me focus probably on certain hot issues that were of concern during the time I spent in Iraq, which is 2008, 2012. So that was, for your knowledge, it was a period when Prime Minister al-Maliki was sort of fully sat in his office and expanded his authority, undisputed authority. And let me also tell you one thing, probably few people know about it. That's my boss, the SRG, Ed Melkert, has left Iraq. His mandate was not renewed by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon because he had disputes with Prime Minister al-Maliki. Al-Maliki was not happy with the results of the elections, and he requested UNAMI to recount the ballots. The SRG refused. Al-Maliki decided to get rid of him, and eventually he left Iraq without having a mandate renewed. General SRG, he leaves the country, he goes to another. In the case of Melkert, he did not renew his mandate. Just to tell you how much the control of the government of Iraq over UNAMI. So nothing could be done without the satisfaction of the government. Now, when the SOFA agreement came into force, the authority, the American authorities, specifically Task Force 134, which is the brigade that was in charge of running the prisons in Iraq. Task 134 was commanded by Brigadier General Quantock. Probably he holds the best records and best archives about the situation of the prisons in Iraq since 2003. And he's now on retirement. I'm sure, as you, John, he will be quite free to talk about the situation. And I think it's good to get contact with him for those who want to research the situation. I was the intermediary between the government of Iraq and the American forces. And when the prisoners were released, usually the Human Rights Office is involved in supervising the release. But there are certain details when you know about them, you will realize how people disappeared and how people were assassinated. The task force 134, they select the prisoners according to the degree of their so-called the status, how dangerous they are. And people convicted of killings and common law crimes, they are classified as the less dangerous prisoners, while people who were suspected of being insurgents or just suspected of being probably a possibility of threat to security and order, those ones are classified as the top security people of top concern. So when they come to be released, they are sort of put according to how dangerous they are, and then they're given a badge. And that badge is put on their chest and a banner on their head, a white banner. So they will be recognized easily among those who are going to be released and those who will be handed over to be kept in detention places by the government of Iraq. When the people come to leave the detention facility, there are others waiting for them outside. When you have a badge on your chest and a banner on your head, obviously you are easily picked up and you disappear. So the discrepancy in the figures that the American forces would free and the discrepancy with the figures the government of Iraq receives is huge. Sometimes we receive from the Americans that this month we have released 750. And then we receive the figure from the government of Iraq saying that this month we received from the Americans 250. So the difference between 250 and 750, that is counted as disappeared. And nobody is responsible about it because the Americans will say, we have freed them. And the Iraqis will say, we didn't receive them. So where did they go? What happened to them? Nobody knows up till today. In addition to this, the policy adopted since your mandate, John, it's always, I mean, the characteristic is based on sectarian. And the population of the prisons was 85% Sunni, and the rest is all others. So you will see that arrests and detention was implemented on a sectarian basis. The other thing I would like to underline is that because of the type of the mandate of the UNAMI, access to prisons was not easy for everybody, even though UNAMI till 2012 was under Chapter 7. But still, the government of Iraq has to give its agreement for anything undertaken by UNAMI. So visiting prisons has to be arranged by the Iraqi authorities. And we had very limited access to prisons. And if you know that the Americans set up 3 major detention centers, namely Camp Buka in Basra, Taji in the north of London, and Cropper near the international airport of Baghdad. These 3 ones, just Buka in the south, hosted sometimes up to 25,000 detainees. 25,000 detainees, The Americans jokingly refer to it as the University of Recruitment of Terrorists. And for your knowledge, Abu Bakr Baghdadi, one of the students of this university from Boca. It's a real mess of management of prisons, although, to be fair, the Americans implemented a policy of respecting the international humanitarian law in dealing with this. And the American staff was properly trained. While the most dangerous thing is that the prisons run by the Iraqis are done in completely ignorance of international humanitarian law and the rule of law in general. Why is that? The Iraqi law provides for the Ministry of Justice to run prisons. And those lucky ones who went through the due process of law, they end up in prisons run by the Ministry of Justice. But besides the Ministry of Justice prisons, there were prisons run by the Ministry of Interior. There are prisons run by the Ministry of Defense. Prisons run by the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs for the juveniles. And prisons run privately by the services of the Prime Minister, the notorious prison Sharaf, which lots of people disappeared, end up in Sharaf. Those were run privately by the office of the Prime Minister. In addition to that, there were prisons or detention centers run by political parties, particularly in the north, in the Kurdistan region. So this situation made it impossible for UNAMI or NGOs to access these prisons. And lots of abuses and torture did take place in these places. And I'm sure there was a period where we cooperated very closely with the Ministry of Human Rights at the time, because there used to be a Ministry of Human Rights in Iraq, and probably it was the ministry that best cooperated with UNAMI. And they, on our request, they investigated some places, and they discovered what had never been described or reported in the UNAMI reports. You know how the procedure is about UNAMI's reports on human rights. It's, first of all, the information is passed on to UNAMI through the security forces, the Iraqi security forces. UNAMI has no access. And then the period I'm talking about, during my period, we cannot go anywhere without very, very dramatic security arrangements. And to go out with those, first of all, we had the escort of the American forces, and we have the escort also, closer escort of the Iraqi forces, and the escort, the bodyguards of the United Nations. So with all these dramatic escorts and arrangements, you have to, in order to visit any place, you have to undertake arrangements that would last sometime the whole month. And I used to go to the Ministry of Justice. We occupied the Ministry of Justice 3 days before I arrived to the place. So this makes it impossible, because the policy of the United Nations was zero tolerance in terms of security. So this zero tolerance of security made it impossible for UNAMI to objectively investigate or monitor. So we receive all information from the Iraqi security forces. That puts a big question mark on the reports of human rights. The figures we receive them through the Iraqi security forces. The bodies that were described in the newspapers thrown in Mosul's streets early in the morning, also, and blamed on Daesh and Al-Qaeda. Also, those bodies, it's the security forces that tell us that we found a number of bodies, and they point out Al-Qaeda. And we have credible information we receive from the civil society telling us that people have been killed in prisons and thrown in the street early in the morning, and then they were reported as victims of Al-Qaeda and Daesh. And let me, probably the time is running, and I want to move a little bit towards other issues concerning the work of UNAMI. There was a time when, particularly after 2010, they started talking about creating a new mechanism for the protection of minorities. And let me say that the protection of minorities, there are levels of favoritism in terms of, there are some minorities that are more protected than others. I personally objected to that. And I said we need to protect on the basis of citizenship, the rule of law, and access to justice. So all Iraqis, without distinction, regardless who they are, regardless of their religion, their ethnicity, they should be protected according to the rule of law and the judiciary system of Iraq. But UNAMI insisted that we need to create a mechanism. I warned that that mechanism will lead eventually to dividing the society in an irreconcilable way. But still, when diplomats turn up into my office, they ask me, how is that community? I don't want to name those communities who are better protected than others because I don't want to contribute in this kind of manipulation. Let me say there is some concern that UNAMI was set up to assist in the reconciliation and reconstruction. The setting, the security setting, and being sort of locked up in the green zone made it impossible. And let me say, without distinction, all agencies, UN agencies, 18 agencies based in the green zone, they spent months and months just sort of bored in the bar of UNAMI underground, just drinking and waiting for the days to pass. They have nothing to do. Huge money spent. We do nothing because we don't have access, and security, for security reasons, we're not allowed to get out of the prison. This situation really made UNAMI a mission, a redundant mission that should be ended. And in fact, the Deputy Secretary General in charge of the DPA came to Baghdad in 2011 in order to terminate the mandate of UNAMI. So we started closing down offices. UNAMI had a big office in Jordan. It was closed. The offices of UNAMI in Kuwait were reduced to exclusively to the technical issues, providing material and whatever is needed. But the presence of UNAMI in Kuwait was completely or literally closed. And we were supposed to, in 2012, just hand over the keys to the government of Iraq. I'm not aware how UNAMI all of a sudden was revived, and I hear they still produce some human rights report. in the situation, the money spent on one individual in my period, one person cost $1,000 a month, and the mission was over 1,000 people. So think about how much money, $1,000 a month for each person in terms of security. So when you consider this kind of money, we should ask, is it really worth it to keep UNAMI going? While the real need of monitoring the situation, we need one person. We need a special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iraq. That would reduce the budget of the United Nations with a huge amount. But somehow, they keep spending these unlimited amounts. And I will not probably, out of respect to John, I will not talk about corruption within the system, because the corruption is rife. Now,
You just said it.
shouldn't we request a special rapporteur and close down UNAMI? I will leave this question for you. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you very much also for your interesting presentation. And it's same for you. I would like to listen for hours and really. Well, after having heard about the flaws in setting up a mechanism like UNAMI, we heard about the restrictions and the dependency of UNAMI from politics that makes real investigations impossible, gives way to total impunity and insecurity. So there is no real prospect for reconciliation and reconstitution of the country. So, of course, I hope we will have the time to go more into detail after this. But now I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, Inder Comar. He is an US-American lawyer and the director of Just Atonement. And he has been working a lot on the case of Iraq, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing about his expertise.
Good afternoon. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I have some prepared remarks, and then I also have some remarks that I will speak about when I talk about certain discrete legal issues. So as we all know, on March 20th, 2003, the United States of America led a coalition of countries in invading and occupying the Republic of Iraq. And today, 15 years later, the prospect of accountability for the invasion, which, as has already been described, was an illegal act of aggression under international law, seems as remote as ever. So the question that I'd like to answer today is, can we hold those people accountable who invaded Iraq? And I think it leads to a bigger question, is can we ever hold great powers responsible for the international crimes committed by those great powers? And my argument today is very simple, is that if we do nothing to hold great powers responsible, and in particular the people who destroyed Iraq, then it is only a matter of time before a crime as horrific as the Iraq invasion and, quite frankly, the annihilation of another member state of the United Nations takes place. So to date, there has only been one attempt, just one single attempt that I know of, to hold members of the Bush administration responsible for the crime of aggression against Iraq. And that was in 2013 when a group of Iraqi refugees filed a lawsuit in the United States, in the United States federal court, asking the federal court to investigate an inquiry about the crime of aggression that took place when the United States invaded. And as part of that effort, these Iraqi plaintiffs produced evidence to the court showing that certain members of the Bush administration, like Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, in particular Undersecretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, had had been writing about and advocating an invasion and a military overthrow of the Iraqi government since as early as 1997. And this was all public materials that they had testified before Congress about. There was evidence presented to the court that in January of 2001, so the very first week of office, the first national security meeting was about how do we invade Iraq. And there was evidence presented, again from publicly available sources, showing that the day after 9/11, or the day of 9/11 and the day after 9/11, there was a widespread discussion of how can we utilize 9/11 as the reason to invade Iraq. So all this information was presented to the federal court, asking for an investigation, asking for reparations to be paid to Iraqi civilians. But in 2017, after 4 years of litigation, the federal court dismissed the effort on the basis that President Bush and others had an immunity, not under international law, but under domestic U.S. law. And that immunity was afforded to them by Congress, and that immunity was more powerful and stronger than any international law obligations. So this case, which is the Saleh case, Saleh v. Bush case, is the only case that I know of. And despite several meaningful opportunities for the court to analyze the crime of aggression and investigate, the court in several instances declined to do that and specifically said it was not something they were going to undertake. Now, that is obviously a disappointment, but I think it's indicative of the approach that national courts will take when they're confronted with the crimes of their own leaders. As much as this is not unique to the American example, my guess is that a Russian court would say the same thing about the crimes of Putin, or a Canadian court would say the same thing about the crimes of their leaders. So when we talk about great powers, this is indicative, I think, of what the national approach might be, even for a crime as heinous as the Iraqi crime. So how can we impose accountability over the great powers for those crimes? Is the vision of a world governed by international law so obscure now that we just have to let the great powers commit their crimes with abandon? And I don't think that's the case. I think we can actually create a world like that. I think that is the vision of the United Nations, but it will require several changes internationally, nationally, and then I think also at a personal level. So when we talk about international changes, I'll talk about the current context and then offer some suggestions. So while international law recognizes the crime of aggression, there are currently very few avenues for jurisdiction. It is true now that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction for the crime of aggression for countries who have adopted the amendments that activate that jurisdiction. But the Iraq War happened long before this jurisdiction was activated, and as many of you know, the United States is not a party to the Rome Statute, and it will fight tooth and nail any attempt by the ICC to exercise that jurisdiction. The adoption of those amendments by the ICC is nonetheless very important, because as part of that process, when countries adopt those amendments, they have to change their domestic laws to provide for the crime of aggression, and that's something that requires that country to think about the crime of aggression. It raises the profile of this Nuremberg-era crime, and I think it does leave some hope that as the ICC can evolve, it can make this crime more important and make it more relevant. It changes the dialogue of how countries act and speak to each other. There has been a failure, I think, by the UN in general to investigate the causes of the Iraq War. I think the lone example is Kofi Annan's famous statement right after the invasion, that from his perspective as Secretary General, the war was illegal. He said that flat out, as I think many of you may remember. But that was effectively the lone pronouncement from the United Nations about the invasion. And I think even the Human Rights Council has failed to examine the causes of the war or to connect the glaring, obvious dots between the situation in Iraq today and the causes of the conflict stemming from the invasion. It's as if we're expected to believe that the violence in Iraq emerged out of thin air, perhaps from some demonic genie, from some mysterious lamp. But the causes of the violence are not mysterious. They're very human causes. So what can we do to open up the avenues of accountability at the international level? Let's talk about that. It's a difficult subject because it requires us to contemplate the possibility of reform. And for many people, reform is, seems impossible. But the alternative to reform is the status quo. And I would argue that the status quo, which is in which countries, member states of the United Nations, can be totally destroyed by other countries, is not tenable. It's something that we have to reject. So I think first we have to talk openly about the necessity of Security Council reform, and this is a big conversation, much bigger than I have time for. But we have to remove the exemption from scrutiny that the great powers have given themselves through the Security Council. The current Security Council framework is not only an impediment to genuine peace, it is an active agent for war and conflict, as I sit here today. And I think there's no greater example of how the Security Council failed than the Iraq War. So despite the effective veto of the French, who demanded more time and investigation, and the failure before they would consent to some type of military action, there was nonetheless a failure to secure a second resolution, and the United Kingdom, the United States, invaded Iraq anyway, committing the crime of aggression. So that is going to happen again if nothing is done. But we need more than just Security Council reform, and I think I would also point to support and sustenance of the International Criminal Court. So I recognize that it is, again, this is not an institution that is perfect, and there are some very legitimate criticisms that can be made against the ICC, but we cannot overlook the fact that for the first time in human history, we can wake up to a world where there is an international court, an international institution that is permanent, it's global, and with jurisdiction and power to scrutinize activities of countries and their leaders for international crimes, including the crime of aggression. This is a marvel of human achievement. I mean, I think we all marvel at our iPhones or whatever it is, or we can marvel at futuristic technology, but let's acknowledge the legal technology that we've developed with the ICC, and it's a powerful institution if we give it time and space and the mandate. And the chief reason the ICC remains limited is the great powers hampering its ability to undertake greater investigation. And you can look no further than the diktat of current National Security Advisor John Bolton, who recently threatened ICC personnel, including judges and prosecutors, with U.S. criminal prosecution if they dared to investigate American crimes committed in Afghanistan. So according to Bolton and others who think like him, the United States must remain free to commit crimes at its pleasure, and it will not be restrained in doing so by other lawyers, judges, or courts. And this was the thinking and the reasoning that has killed so many Iraqis, frankly, which destroyed that country, which is currently destroying other countries in the Middle East and elsewhere. It is this type of thinking that is becoming more pernicious, more formidable, more dangerous. It is quite frankly death sitting on a pale horse. So let us finally talk about the Human Rights Council, and I think the Human Rights Council can do more. It can appoint a special rapporteur, as has already been mentioned. Just like every other UN institution, the Council is under attack from those who wish to avoid scrutiny, and we should do more to support the work and the efforts of the Human Rights Council. At the national level, what we can do, so that was talking about international institutions, but there's a lot that can happen at the national level. And I offer just a couple suggestions. One is we should encourage countries to think about the concept of universal jurisdiction. The national courts of civilized countries should be open and they should have their doors open to civil and criminal investigation and prosecution of individuals who have committed grave offenses of international law. So almost 20 years ago, General Pinochet from Chile had a warrant issued for his extradition to stand to account for his crimes committed while leader of Chile. Pinochet was a very favored Western leader, and in hindsight, his indictment by a Western court seems close to unbelievable. But independent nations who support the rule of law must remember the Pinochet example and open their doors to investigating the crimes of the great powers. And I acknowledge this is a very tough thing to do, and I'm not naive when I suggest this. In 2003, Belgium tried to do this very thing and open an investigation, or their courts open an investigation into the 1991 Amiria shelter bombing by the United States. And the United States, in response, threatened that it would destroy Belgium's status as a center for international institutions. Belgium changed its law that year to stop the investigation. So I know it's going to be tough to stand up to the threats of the great powers, but the alternative is to live in a world where the strong continue to exploit the weak. And when we talk about universal jurisdiction, we should include in that discussion and dialogue the crime of aggression. The crime of aggression is the supreme crime under international law. It is a crime that has been well defined at the Nuremberg trials and now through the ICC's amendments. And I think we also have to be honest that the great powers are not going to police themselves. The great powers are too powerful, and they're not going to let their courts scrutinize their own leaders. This is true of the United States, for sure, as we saw in the Saleh case, but I think it's also true of the other powers as well. And what we need to encourage is other countries to think about very seriously this idea of a universal jurisdiction enacting universal international law. And this can be done not just through national courts, but also through regional courts as well. And finally, I want to talk about at the personal level, what we can do. And this is the third level of change. We talked about the international level, the national level, and the personal level. And here I want to speak from personal experience as an American who lived through the transformation of American national discourse caused by the 9/11 attacks in New York in 2001. It's very clear to me that American leaders intentionally and quite frankly outrageously took advantage of that terrorist attack to create a permanent state of emergency. It's what the Italian theorist Giorgio Agamben might describe as a permanent state of exception. Auf Deutsch, we would say an Ausnahmezustand. This is the German expression for this terrible period in any country's political history where it uses it creates a state of exception that's outside the realm of law. It creates a body of law or government conduct that exists outside of law, and that's quite frankly what we have in the United States today. U.S. leaders lied to the American public and to the international community about Iraq's connections to al-Qaeda, about the Iraqi weapons program. So I lived through all of that, and I can tell you that 15 years after the invasion of Iraq and 17 years after 9/11, in my view, the American public remains unwilling today to face up to the fact that the actions of their government have killed and displaced millions of people, have created untold levels of suffering, and destroyed the legacy of the Nuremberg Tribunal, which was an American-led effort, and the international framework put in place after World War II to prohibit aggression. So Americans appear not to have learned that the glorification of empire and the unquestioning devotion to war is not only a great evil, it is now also destroying their own society and destroying the world more generally. The environment in America today is far more dangerous than it was the day before 9/11. Both a danger to the American political community, to itself, and to the rest of the world. So I think all of us as humans, whatever our nationality, we have to reject this state of exception, the glorification of war and empire, war-making, nuclear weapons. At a personal level, we have to commit ourselves to democratic principles, such as fundamental human rights, peaceful settlement of disputes, to the rule of law, including the international rule of law. And this is a personal choice we have to make. In the words of Camus, we cannot side with the murderers or the accomplices to those murderers, whoever they may be. And let us be honest, because I think when making this choice, it will require a degree of sacrifice, because our entire world, our economics, our politics, our institutions are geared towards empire and the mass slaughter of humans by other humans. So this may mean personally that we have to choose different paths and touch as little as possible the financing and production of war and the weapons of war, and also adopting a politics that calls for dialogue and civilization instead of domination and empire. But we need to make that sacrifice, because that sacrifice, in my view, is the only way we have some chance of a survival as a species. So if we do nothing and continue on our current path, we are looking at some form of human extinction, whether through one last war or because of our inability to deal with the climate crisis. And this is the only way we can tackle those challenges ahead is to kind of adopt a different worldview. So I think there is some hope. I think that there is something that we can do about this at a personal level, at a national level, at an international level. And we have to just dedicate our lives to this ongoing transformation of our political dialogue, our international dialogue to these in this way. It will require some courage from each of us, from our national leaders, from our international institutions, a great type of courage, actually. Because I think to build that, we have to acknowledge the reality that our system is not set up to prevent future attacks like the Iraq War. So I would just end by saying I hope and encourage that we can all find that courage to resist the call of empire and to fight for democracy through democratic means. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for your interesting presentation. You spoke about the lack of accountability for Iraq, but I am very much encouraged that you don't stay, could you turn it up? With a negative, but also give some perspective and hope. And when we look at our three speakers, I would say the bottom line is, of course, the lack of accountability for a war of aggressions, tremendous human rights violations, but also the weakness of UN institutions, the failure to guarantee really impartial investigations, and that there are reforms needed on all levels, beginning from accountability to UN mechanisms and investigations, and also the Human Rights Council. Before we pass to our question and answer sections, I would just like to give the floor to the organizers of this conference. Please, Mrs. Aya, could you just say a few words? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all of you for your continuing interest in strengthening human rights in Iraq. شكرا لكم جميعا.
On behalf of our organization, I would like to thank you all, the co-organizers as well, Geneva Center for Justice and the International Organization for Judicial to combat all forms of discrimination, and the international lawyers would like to thank the panelists for the presentations they have provided about the human rights situation in Iraq by presenting their experience in the different UN activities and work inside Iraq. I would like also to thank all ladies and gentlemen participating with us today, where we're calling all the activities and organizations attending today to pay attention to the human rights situation in Iraq in their activities, in their future activities, considering that the negative impact of the situation on the Iraqi population. And thank you again.
Thank you, Mayor, very much also for your words. So now we have some time for question and answers. I would like to remind you that please introduce yourself if you have a question. We will also take question first. If you have comments, maybe there is a time later, but we will take question first. Introduce yourself. Please be short and concise. And I also remind everybody we have a controversial topic, and it's a challenging topic, but we would like to stick to the United Nations policies and really do everything in the spirit of mutual respect. So I would like to take the first question, yes? Please introduce yourself.
شكرا جزيلا سأتحدث.
Thank you so much. I'm going to speak in Arabic.
نشكر جميع المتداخلين.
I'd like to thank all the panelists. Mr. Tahar has provided us with a background about the situation in Iraq and the role of the United Nations. The negative role, I would say, of the UN there. I think Mr. Tahar was also monitoring the human rights situation there and was in charge of the human rights office in Iraq. He speaks a lot about the situation of the detainees and the prisons and how difficult to access prisons and lack of permission to that. I think there is kind of similarity between the Yemen. I'm Hani al-Aswadi from Yemen. There is kind of similarity between our situation. Now it is very difficult to just monitor all the prisons in the areas controlled by Houthis. And it's difficult to access them. There are some detainees, thousands of detainees who were detained for different reasons, and for black extortion or for trade for money, to be traded or for ransom. In Iraq, you do not speak in details about the interventions, the Iranian interventions. As you know, Iraq is the door of the eastern door. And the Iranian interventions was really bad and caused gross violations to human rights in the country, in Iraq. The Iranian support also in some Arab region is not only limited to Iraq, has been expanded. It is in the Red Sea area, in Yemen. There is support to the Houthis movement, which has negatively impacted the situation. The other issue I'd like to raise here about the United Nations mechanisms. Although, excuse me, هل لديك سؤال؟
الآليات
The UN mechanism negative role, I would like how to improve this role of the UN mechanisms, noting that in Yemen we have the team of experts, but the group of experts issued a kind of weak report about taking inclusively about the violations or some war crimes like Tawahi massacre in Aden or some other mines crimes. I wonder how we can improve these mechanisms in light of the current deteriorated situation in the Arab region and in light of the weakness in the UN system. Thank you. شكرا جزيلا. سوف ناخذ اسمي ليندا لوستا.
So she is activist for a humanitarian organization in Libya?
Yes, and I thanks a lot Aya Saif, who gave me the chance by United Town Agency North. Yeah, to be here today and to talk about the prisoners in Libya. Ma question est la suivante. Avec tout mon respect, j'ai la confiance aux Nations Unies, mais je me demande pourquoi tous les activistes et les gens qui ont le pouvoir d'arrêter toutes ces guerres et toutes ces tortures dans les prisons n'essayent pas de faire quelque chose avant que la drame arrive.
Okay.
C'est ça ma question.
Thank you very much. So her question is, why do people always react after something bad happened and do not prevent these human rights violations? We will take one last question and then we will go give the floor to our speakers, yeah?
Yeah. Thank you very much. شكرا. أريد أن أحيي بالطبع شجاعة جون باتشي وطاهر.
But for his courage and Tahir for entering Iraq under such difficult conditions, because that time it was not possible for UN staff to choose Iraq, but choosing Iraq that time is a kind of, it is an option by them, not imposed by any agency. So I would encourage I would like to thank them for their courage. I have 3 questions. The first question, what are the lessons learned from the UN experience in Iraq and on the role of UN, the negative or positive role of the UN, and how to avoid that today in the case of Libya, Yemen, and tomorrow in Syria, if there is any UN mission to be peacekeeping mission in these countries. What is happening in Libya and Yemen is very difficult. The United Nations is unable of protecting the civilians. The second point about the transitional justice, I recall that the UN mission or the concerned with the human rights issues is the human rights and transitional justice, rule of law and transitional justice. Human rights, rule of law, and transitional justice. Now the same thing in Libya and Yemen, we are going the same direction. So, do you think the UNAMI has encouraged such tendency? What is the outcome that we have reached into after more than 15 years from 2003, the American invasion that destroyed Iraq? Today, we are speaking about transitional justice. Where is transitional justice? Noting that the objective of transitional justice is reconciliation, national reconciliation. It seems that this did not happen. Is it possible for the transitional justice to be a priority under the chaos and civil war situation, the United Nations has to reconsider these priorities from the transitional justice perspective. The third question is about the civil society. In 2003, we did not have a civil society in Iraq as a result of the dictatorship, but after that, we have witnessed a huge number of NGOs that's supported by the UN. Where are they now? Where are these NGOs? Is there any positive outcome of the UN support to civil society, the emerging civil society at that time? Shukran jazilan.
So we had 3 questions here. In some way, this question can be regrouped in saying, okay, the case of Iraq is a very dangerous precedent for the entire world and also for other cases. And if this is not solved, it will have ramifications for the entire world and the entire human rights system. So now I would like to give the floor to our speakers for your answers to these points.
I can have a first go. I was always somewhat suicidal. I think we have to distinguish about, when we speak about human rights violations, there are 2 things, 2 distinct things. First, the identification of the violations of the individual. As Tahar has said, regardless of minority group or sector or whatever, if a violation takes place of an individual's basic rights, that violation has to be discovered and dénoncé and announced. The second is the way you tackle it. You have a special procedure, you have maybe just bilateral tit for tat, you have various ways, but you cannot confuse the 2. The important thing is that the priority should lie with identifying the violation of the individual, because it is the individual that is the common denominator to all this. And that applies to the gentleman's questions. With regard to my dear colleague and friend, I think that and the lessons learned, if you like, the prevention has always been a latecomer, and it was always based on the experience of disasters. So what they would call in the States the Monday morning quarterback, where we are all clever after the thing has happened. And the efforts of the international system have been and still are primitive. I spoke about training, and I've done quite a lot of briefing and training and so on, but you have to admit it's still primitive. And that lies in the absence of the culture within those that are governing and those that are governed for respect of the first element, which is the individual. The lessons that we have learned, I think, are the need to keep, God help us, honest about the realities, and not to build on presumptions of half-truths. This is a report on the death penalty in Iraq, done in 2014. And if you read this and you hear Tahar, it's not too good, because the tables are very clear how many people were executed in what year. But that's only a fraction of the reality in terms of the protection of the right to life. And therefore, how can we stem, with the lesson that I have learned from this is that we cannot get a ready-made suit off the shelf and apply it to any country. We have to develop the cure from the actual malaise that we have identified. But always the identification of the malaise comes first. And that is very simple, talking to people, recording what they say. Chile became very popular in the Commission on Human Rights after Pinochet, after 2 years. 73 was the putsch, 75 was the first action by the Commission. Why? Because Chile was silly enough to exile Chilean citizens, and most of them went to Europe. And of course, they went to countries in Europe who were sensitive to their situation, and they landed here in this building, telling the Commission personally what happened. And the Commission listened and had no choice but to try to act in its own way. So we constantly are learning from the experiences that we make. And therefore, one lesson that we have obtained is that we should not simply blindly apply what we have done somewhere to another. Each situation has its own priorities. The case of Iraq that we described today is a classic case where you have lists of reports and you have so many situations, but you still have a rotten situation of human rights on individual level. I'm not talking about Libya and Yemen, but I'm happy to do so in detail. But on the question of transitional justice, that's another thing. In the UN system, we have a curse, and that's the acronym. TJ, transitional justice. A to J, access to justice. Once you put A to J, you know what you're talking about. But you're not. You are putting a label on a situation which is much more complicated than simply saying, it's a problem of access to justice. What are the implications is what we have to ask ourselves. And therefore, in Iraq, we have what we have said between Tahar and my experience is that we have had a deterioration. When I was there, there was a unity among the various components of Iraq against the invader. It brought the Iraqis together because they could not stand being occupied. As that receded, the hard realities of the society came out, and there was not, and still is not, a culture to be able to address it. So transitional justice, again, has to be ad hoc. It has to be carefully devised and monitored constantly and adjusted constantly. It is not just a one-time resolution and then, halas, it's gone, that's fine, we have a resolution. Okay? Civil society. When I started in Iraq, there was civil society. They happened to be anti-Saddam, and therefore they were considered to be, one of those people. But they were victims of torture. They were victims of political discrimination. They were victims of the guys with the ears clipped, who did not refuse to participate in the war, and so on and so forth. But they were victims. And they had problems. Disappearance, people, they had families. There were women with families who could not live because their husbands and fathers could not be certified dead. A lot of them. And so, therefore, we need to have civil society measure it by the degree to which it is close to the reality of the individual. Always, that is the root. And that is, for me, after all these years, what it boils down to. And that is why I have a problem with the Council, because the gap between the Council and the individual has become cosmic. We really have a problem there. When I see something, I watch it on webcast, and I see NGO taking the place of each other to have a quick 2 minutes, blah, 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 and nobody's listening. That is worse than not having it. So therefore, we need, again, civil society needs to organize itself. I am preaching a discrete revolution here, but certainly a revolution nonetheless. I think we need to get our act together. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Do we have any more questions? Because we just have 3 minutes left.
Maybe I need to say a word as
Okay,
well.
sorry. Then.
First, in my intervention, I would like to put diplomacy aside and talk about the real experience on the ground. The year we shut down the office of UNAMI in Jordan, we opened an office in Tehran. In answer to your question about the Iranian influence on the situation in the region. So you will ask me what is the purpose of opening an office in Tehran. I will not answer that. You ask the United Nations. I would like also for Faraj. Faraj, you know the situation better than I do. And the situation is that about UNAMI, there is a mandate, but very, very restricted mandate. And in terms of finance and policy. First of all, in terms of policy, on a daily basis, we need to go to the American embassy to get briefed and to get directives, guidelines. On the Iranian influence and interference, we also visit the Iranian embassy in Baghdad on a weekly basis. And we report to them before we report to Geneva. So these are realities, and this is what I'm saying, let's put diplomacy aside. On the rule of law, Faraj, it's a real institutional crisis in the United Nations. The duplicacy of, and the fighting, the infighting between agencies. The rule of law is addressed by UNDP, UNOPS, UNAMI, and other agencies. And we end up months and months discussing and fighting about who gets what in terms of budget and in terms of programs to be implemented on the ground. And at the end of the year, the government of Iraq will tell us, you do what I tell you, and I choose the agency that implements the program. So these realities makes UNAMI and all UN agencies present in Iraq completely inefficient if you take the whole thing in the context of the security requirements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we have we have reached the end of our panel, so it is, and we don't have more time. So I'm very sorry, but I am glad to announce that after this event there will be refreshments just outside the room. So I'm sorry it's not possible to take any questions anymore, but over these refreshments you will have the, please, I'm the moderator, please, I'm about closing this. I encourage you, please, I would kindly ask you now to close your microphone because we are about ending this event. You are very free to talk to our speakers at the end of the event. So thank you very, very much for having been here with us. It has been a privilege and hope to talk to you outside. Thank you.